Okay, so here I'm going to look at the first chapter in Tom Cheetham, The World Turned Inside Out, Henry Corbin and the Angel Out Ahead, which is called Against the Times. And I'm going to go straight into this. So what I would recommend is watch the first 5 minutes of the first video in this series. That's where I give the context and introduction for my approach, slowly but surely, to the work of Henry Corbin and situates the relevance of, well, the imaginal in what I consider to be important, although one may not consider that necessary to know. Okay, so Tom Cheetham, The World Turned Inside Out, Chapter 1, Against the Times. The first section called The Act of Presence. If there is a single first step on the road to the cosmos that Corbin invites us to enter, it may be the simple, passionate refusal to accept the understanding of ourselves and the world that dominates modern secular consciousness. The foundations for this worldview are historical and materialist throughout. All of our means of understanding converge upon a single unified vision of reality. History, sociology, psychology, biology, physics, and engineering, all of the human and all of the natural sciences are versions of the same reductive program. All are based on laws of historical causality in a world composed wholly of matter in space. In a world so conceived, nothing can be more real than anything else. In a world so conceived, nothing can be more real than anything else. In a world so conceived, consciousness is reducible to and explicable in terms of physical, biological, social, and historical forces. Such a world is radically incompatible with the existence of persons. Such a world is radically incompatible with the existence of persons. This is nihilism. As long as we feel alienated and exiled in such a world, there is hope. But the very real danger is that we will abandon ourselves to this world in our hopelessness, abandon ourselves to those impersonal forces that drive us blindly to our ends. And in doing so, we will disappear. There will no longer be persons. I might briefly pause to comment here. I won't do this very often, but I think it's reasonable to focus on consciousness as foundational and irreducible, and to reject the sort of outdated determinist materialist sort of Cartesian conception that invalidates personhood. I think all of that is sound. However, I also know that through anthropology, cognitive science, psychology, biology, sociology, to say nothing of history and physics and engineering, that we can understand the, I could say optimal conditions, but that might not quite be the right phrase. I'm saying that we can understand a lot about the right way to live. That would be my claim. I think the whole point of the the awareness of the meaning crisis, the context of the loneliness epidemic of domicide, and so on, the loss of home, is that we can understand that humans are not designed for that. And that if we can restore the right conditions for personhood, that personhood has a better chance of arising. And I feel that an understanding of those disciplines that I mentioned is extremely helpful in navigating this time of societal transition. And so I don't want it to be dismissed. And I don't agree with the equation of all of that with this is nihilism. I think it can be, but it doesn't have to be. And if we reject all of that out of hand, I feel that there are equivalent dangers. That said, the focus that we see in Corbin and Heidegger on presence, in being, I do think that is in a way unavoidable and deeply necessary. Anyway, I won't say any more. So Corbin, all of this Corbin refuses in its entirety. His claim is that in order to understand how it came about, and in order to escape from it, we must understand it as a spiritual, philosophical, and metaphysical problem. This does not mean that it is an abstract and merely philosophical undertaking. The only philosophy that interests him is one that is effective. That we conceive of metaphysics and of philosophy as merely intellectual is symptomatic of our problem. An understanding of ourselves and our situation that is true and therefore effective in guiding the soul towards its truth requires metaphysical comprehension at the most personal and immediate level. A focus on the reality of the human person in reaction to the scientific rationalism of the Enlightenment, the abstraction of Hegelian idealism, and later against fascist and totalitarian ideologies, took many forms in the late 19th and early 20th century European theology and philosophy. But of the most importance for understanding Corbin is the phenomenological philosophy of Edmund Husserl and his student, Martin Heidegger. The significance of Heidegger's monumental Being and Time for Corbin is not so much that it caused a revolution in his outlook, but rather that it provided a crystallization of themes and issues that were already gathering in his thinking through his study of both Western philosophy and Islamic thought. Like Corbin, Heidegger had been deeply engaged in the study of medieval philosophy and theology, and wrote his first major academic treatise on Duns Scotus. As Corbin points out, this provides a significant link between Heidegger's intellectual background and his own, in particular since the medieval concept of grammatica speculativa, which is fundamental to Luther's thought, had a profound impact on Corbin, as we shall see. But without question, Heidegger's work was, in Corbin's own words, of decisive importance. There's a relevant footnote. The relationship between them, Heidegger and Corbin, is complex. Corbin himself discussed in some detail the influences of Heidegger's early work. Robert Avens has written perceptively concerning Heidegger's relationship to Corbin and to James Hillman in The New Gnosis and Imagination is Reality and elsewhere. A lot of other writings. And a lot of those writings of Avens emphasize Heidegger's later, more Gnostic writings. And Corbin explicitly avoided such an analysis in his conversations with Nemo, who's a person, not a fish, claiming that an analysis of the later Heidegger and his potential affinities with mystical theologies of any sort would require and repay the work of several lifetimes. Dariush Shayegan also devotes considerable space to a discussion of Heidegger's relations with Corbin in his book, Henry Corbin. Okay, that's about Heidegger and Corbin. Now we have a bit about Heidegger. As is the case with Corbin, Heidegger's life work involves a fundamental critique of Western thought and of the course of Western history. That this rather sweeping plan was intended from the start is evident even at the beginning of Being and Time. Section 6 is somewhat immodestly entitled, quote, "On the task of destroying the history of ontology." His hope is to provide a radical critique by getting at the roots of what it means for us to be at all. Being and Time is ostensibly about the question of the meaning of being. Of the utmost importance is Heidegger's choice of standpoint for his task. And now we get a quote from Heidegger. Quote, "Looking at something, understanding and conceiving it, choosing, access to it, all of these ways of behaving are constitutive for our inquiry, and therefore are modes of being for those particular entities which we, the inquirers, are ourselves." Again, looking at something, understanding and conceiving it, choosing, access to it, all of these ways of behaving are constitutive for our inquiry, and therefore are modes of being for those particular entities which we, the inquirers, are ourselves. Thus, to work out the question of being adequately, we must make an entity, the inquirer, transparent in his own being. Thus, to work out the question of being adequately, we must make an entity, the inquirer, transparent in his own being. The very asking of this question is an entity's mode of being. The very asking of this question is an entity's mode of being, and as such, gets its essential nature from what is inquired about, namely being. This entity which each of us is himself, and which includes inquiring as one of the possibilities of its being, we shall denote by the term Dasein. Dasein, or being there. Dasein is Heidegger's way of naming that about us that has, in some sense, quote, ontological priority over every other entity. That about us which allows anything to appear at all. This Dasein that we are has a complex ontological and phenomenological structure that had not been noticed explicitly before, and that Heidegger intends to uncover. In order to begin the revelation of these structures of being, he distinguishes those aspects that pertain to the fundamental structure of Dasein from those that are the characteristic only of our everyday existence in the world. The former, deeper level, he calls ontological and existential. The latter, more superficial level, he calls ontic and existentiel, literally existent, IELL. Anyway, this distinction is basic. So it's essentially a deep level and a shallow level. It is on the deeper, more obscure level that the ontological priority of Dasein resides. So this is basics in Heidegger, which continues for a short time. Dasein is, literally translated, being there, being there. It provides the condition for the possibility of anything being present at all. This is the crucial intuition that will make Heidegger's work so important for Corbin. Corbin stresses that the Da of Dasein is the quote act of presence. The Da of Dasein is the act of presence. There's an important footnote here. So talking about the act of presence as the Da of Dasein, Cheetham says, we might ponder here a comparison between Heidegger's attempt to provide a transhuman centrality to something like consciousness and Jung's African revelation on the Athai plains in November 1925. The relationship between Jung's psychology and the phenomenology of Husserl, Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty, and their followers is interesting and important, and throws light on Corbin's appropriation of themes from both groups. See Roger Brooke, Jung and Phenomenology. So I'm gonna comment about that Jung's African revelation in 1925 concerns Lévi-Bruhl's participation mystique and the underlying sense of sort of unconscious unity that is latent within our awareness. It's a kind of original participation. And so Jung's focus on the revelatory power of the archetype of the self is partly that it organizes and orders consciousness through bringing the sense of unity, of oneness, more deeply into consciousness. And this is in some way equivalent to Heidegger's attempt to, quote, provide a transhuman centrality to something like consciousness. I've talked about Jung's sort of thought linking the archetype of the self, the sense of unity, revelation, original participation, participation mystique, and the significance of the symbol of the cross, as in mandala figures, in a series on Jung on Christianity. And the comparison to Heidegger is apt. The difference here is the question of how. How do we get back to the depths? And yeah, if we understand that it's via symbol, via image, via imaginal practice, as well as creativity, then I think leaning more toward Jung and, as it may happen, Corbin, rather than Heidegger, can definitely help, especially in the biopsychosocial context of intentional practice and community of practitioners, because not everyone can read Heidegger. and not everyone should read Heidegger. Okay. Leaving that behind, we were saying that Dasein is, translated literally, being there. It provides the condition for the possibility of anything being present at all. This is the crucial intuition that will make Heidegger's work so important for Corbin. He stresses that the Da of Dasein is the act of presence. The analysis thus begins with presence as the fundamental given, not with a knowing subject, or with energy, or with matter, not with any kind of thing at all. This kind of presence, for Heidegger, is ontologically prior to the appearance of a subject or an ego, prior to anything as restricted as human consciousness. In this way, he attempts to stand outside all the vexing metaphysical dualisms, phenomena and noumena, subject and object, idealist and materialist. This analysis is an attempt to provide a way of understanding ourselves and the world that is at once rigorously philosophical and metaphysical, but not in any way abstract. This analytic of Dasein is to be rooted in the multitude of ways in which we are in the world, and is situated outside positivist or indeed of any of the traditional categories of philosophical thought. Yeah, so just briefly, the obvious criticism is that is the same one that's can be leveled at the Platonists, at Viveki, at Heidegger, at all these sort of people, is that it's so elitist. And even though it may not be abstract, it may be deeply existential, phenomenological, right? To me, the whole point is the democratization of enlightenment and the prescription for, the distributed cognition of collective intelligence and the co-creative problem solving in groups. That really shows because it might not be abstract, but not all of us are like Heidegger. Not all of us have access to the work of any of these people. And so it's bringing this down and down and among and into practice that I think is what will ultimately make it to be meaningful. And so at least we understand Heidegger's orientation to this analytic of Dasein. And I'm ultimately saying that success, the success of this kind of analytic, whether in Corbin, whether in Jung, in Heidegger, they're all trying to get back to the depths, back to the root, back to consciousness itself. I feel that a condition of that success is the biopsychosocial context that I am pointing to the inevitability for. I'll say more about that at a different point, but the point is that Heidegger's way of life is actually preventing him from getting at preventing him from succeeding in the task that he set himself, namely this analysis of Dasein. And as the footnote says, whether Heidegger, succeeds in accomplishing his purpose has been the subject of a cascade of academic production since 1927. Robert Avens, cites Hans Jonas, a scholar of Gnosticism and a former student of Heidegger's. Jonas observes that Heidegger objects to calling man a rational animal, since it places humans too low. Jonas says, quote, in reality, the lowering to Heidegger consists in placing man in any scale, that is, in a context of nature as such. Heidegger and Corbin differ fundamentally on the question of where Dasein is situated ontologically, as we will see. For Corbin and the mystical theosophers, There is no autonomous natural order except that posited when we deceive ourselves into immobilizing nature by conceiving it as simply objective. Anyway, it's somewhat obscure. The point for me would be that in Heidegger, the place from out of which we operate is presumed and then questioned. There's an idea that we, anyway, I won't go on about it. I'm going to leave that there, but it has to do with the relationship between presence and place, 3 and 4, consciousness and the context of consciousness, or between noesis and gnosis, perspective and participation in Verbeke. And the point, I think, is that they arise mutually and go together. There is no getting at consciousness without getting at the world or nature. And there is no getting at nature or the world without consciousness. They arise mutually. Anyway, moving on. So this is still about Heidegger, and it says, this is a revolutionary ontology within the tradition of Western metaphysics, one that is, in Heidegger's terminology, concrete, and takes as fundamental a close examination of the ways in which we exist in the world. Sorry. This is a revolutionary ontology within the tradition of Western metaphysics, one that is, in Heidegger's terminology, concrete, and takes as fundamental a close examination of the ways in which we exist in the world. The analysis of Dasein is, in other words, phenomenological. It begins with a descriptive analysis of how phenomena appear. This is explicitly not an attempt to reduce or explain one thing or appearance by another. The aim is the disclosure, the uncovering of that which shows itself in the appearances. Corbin's understanding of the methods and goals of phenomenology is deeply influenced by his understanding of Heidegger. But at the same time, he was to find resonances in this method with aspects of Islamic thought that were to allow him to go far beyond Heidegger's analysis. Everyone who reads Being and Time is confronted with the difficult task of making sense of the numerous neologisms. The text is subtle and complex. The notoriously tortuous writing is not difficult because it is abstract. It is difficult because Heidegger is attempting to create a vocabulary that can break through the traditional categories of Western thought into a language that can reveal the most primordial and concrete images, but at the same time, hidden from our everyday consciousness. Corbin's response to this challenge is revealing. His copy of Being and Time was marked throughout by glosses in Arabic. Corbin's genius is in part as a comparative phenomenologist, and part of his work is to make real, to valorize, as he likes to say, the worlds of other times and other cultures. He will move in worlds where the basic conditions of experience are radically different from those of the modern West, and increasingly, of course, from the entire westernized world. And it is partly by means of Heidegger's understanding of the primordial priority of Dasein that he found the means and the philosophical justification for doing so. As a philosopher placed between two cultures, Corbin is in a nearly unique position to stand on the boundaries of the world and to feel the full force of the encounter. He will need to orient himself to find that center that he is seeking, and that very need will help him towards it. The orientation required must contain within itself the answer to the question of relativism that Corbin calls spiritual universes. Again, quote, as a philosopher placed between two cultures, Corbin is in a nearly unique position to stand on the boundaries of the worlds and to feel the full force of the encounter. He will need to orient himself to find that center that he is seeking, and that very need will help him towards it. The orientation required must contain within itself the answer to the question of relativism that Corbin calls spiritual universes. Heidegger's primordial ontology helps to provide that standpoint. A phenomenology of primordial presence goes right to the root of our experience of both space and time, and, of course, therefore, of the very stuff of the world. If space and time are founded upon something deeper, on a mode of presence that in some way determines their characteristics and is not separable from how they appear, then it is to that mode of presence that we must turn our attention if we are to truly understand ourselves and our world. And here is the place to focus if we wish to free ourselves from it. It is upon the mode of being of this Dasein, this being centered on the act of presence itself, that all else depends. The analysis of space and time must not begin by regarding them as given, but rather by investigating the mode of presence by means of which they themselves are revealed. To begin with, we must realize that we are not in space in the way in which we have come to believe that we are. It is truer to say that we spatialize a world. We get a quote from Corbin. Orientation is a primary phenomenon of our presence in the world. A human presence has the property of spatializing a world around it. And this phenomenon implies a certain relationship of man with the world, his world. This relationship being determined by the very mode of his presence in the world. The four cardinal points, east and west, north and south, are not things encountered by this presence, but directions which express its sense, man's acclimatization to the world, his familiarity with it. To have this sense is to orient oneself in the world. The ways in which we experience space depend not upon a presumed objective uniform extension given prior to our existence and into which we fit, but rather upon the status of the presence that we adopt, usually unconsciously, and which determines our relationship to those categories of experience we call spatial. Again, the ways in which we experience space depend not upon a presumed objective uniform extension given prior to our existence and into which we fit, but rather upon the status of the presence that we adopt, usually unconsciously. and which determines our relationship to those categories of experience we call spatial. This practice of phenomenology marks a profound departure from the positivism of science and the uniform and public objectivity of Newtonian absolute space. This is difficult enough for a modern consciousness to accept. But with Corbin's Heideggerian analysis of time, an even more radical break with the tradition of modernism occurs. As presence provides the possibility of spatial orientation, so there is a primordial structure that provides the possibility of the time of history. Basically, we have here the idea that time and space both derive from out of presence. Time and space are modes of being in the world. The way to understand this, I think, is to understand them as analogous to the four cardinal points, east and west, north and south. Time and space aren't things encountered, but directions which express our sense, our acclimatization to the world, our familiarity with it. It's very different. All right. As Cheetham said, as presence provides the possibility of spatial orientation, so there is a primordial structure that provides the possibility of the time of history. For Heidegger, one of the fundamental characteristics of Dasein is historicality. Historicality is an ontological structure of Dasein. And it is this that provides the possibility of the occurrence of anything like history. That is, in terms that Corbin will come to use, the manifest history of human events is only possible because there is a deeper hidden structure of Dasein, which makes possible the characteristics of temporality in a more fundamental sense. Again, however, the deep structure is covered over by the everyday, the commonplace. The ontological is hidden by the ontic. As with our perceptions of space, so our experience of manifold modes of temporality can be forgotten, covered over, by the modes of being emphasized and established by our culture and by the everyday, superficial modes of presence we adopt or rather fall into most of the time. I think the way that I would simply try to convey what's being gotten at here is the idea that like we seem to live in a world in which there was a past that we know of and a future that we don't know of. And all of that is a mental construct in a way. There's a way that the possibility for there to be any history, the linear through line that we know, that's a possibility that derives from our consciousness. It's a way to see the world. It's a way to be in the world. It's a mode of being. And we don't notice that. So what we're talking about is Heidegger's phenomenological reorientation toward spatialization, the way we spatialize the world, and temporality in the form of historicality, both of which modes of being in time and space derive from Dasein or consciousness or presence. That is according to Heidegger and by extension Corbin. Quote, Heidegger's treatment of temporality was pivotal for Corbin. Quote, I must say that the course of my work had its origin in the I must say that the course of my work had its origin in the incomparable analysis that we owe to Heidegger, showing the ontological roots of historical science, and giving evidence that there is a historicality more original, more primordial than that which we call universal history, the history of external events. History in the ordinary sense of the term. There is the same relationship between historicality and historicity as between the existential and the existential. This was a decisive moment. Moving on to Cheetham. But the decisive realization is not merely that this more ontologically primordial level exists, but that because the history of external events is somehow subordinate to and takes place within this more basic structure of presence, we are not entirely at its mercy. The phenomenology of presence means that we do not confront a world of, quote, things that are separate from the soul in the manner of objects, that form currents in the manner of a river. For then the dilemma can arise either to throw oneself into the current or to struggle against it. So again, the phenomenology of presence means that we do not confront a world of things that are separate from the soul in the manner of objects, that form currents in the manner of a river. For then the dilemma can arise either to throw oneself into the current or to struggle against it. Corbin wants neither to be submerged in the inexorable current of the time of material things, nor to fight it. Corbin wants neither to be submerged in the inexorable current of the time of material things, nor to fight it. Neither option will suffice, because either way, we are at the mercy of independent objects in quantitative space. We must realize that it is not things or history that have us, which give us life or death. It is we who have them. See, I think, so we're stopping there. That was section 1 in section 1, the act of presence, in chapter 1, Against the Times. Tom Cheetham, The World Turned Inside Out, Henry Corbin, and the Angel Out Ahead. And we were talking about Corbin's relationship with Heidegger and Heideggerian phenomenology, particularly in terms of the program of Heideggerian phenomenology to get back to the root of our being, to analyze Dasein being there, to uncover our deeper levels of our ontology that we unconsciously adopt, revealing deeper aspects of our presence, our being here. And so it's designed to get us beyond and out of the dualistic subject-object, idealist, materialist, metaphysical conceptions that actually structure our worldview. And Corbin is obviously going to take up a lot of this. And specifically, we were looking at how Dasein we tend to, in the modern way, presume that time and space are sort of objects. We have a huge part of our ontological structure is the understanding or conception of time and space that we actually live within. And the idea of phenomenology here through Heidegger is to notice that spatialization of the world and the way that we temporalize the world through, quote, historicality. These are actually ontological structures that derive from presence. They're actually modes of being. And the trouble with all this is that I feel that it has to be brought down into practice. It has to be, because it's really difficult to grasp. And so I think if this is really to become available, inhabitable, accessible, yeah, to me, there's a clear relevance for group practice here. But again, I'm going to keep saying that every time. So to me, it's ultimately not just about the quality of our presence. It's also about the facility with the objects of time space. I won't go on about it though. I'll simply leave all of this where it is. I think I'll say one other thing, which is that there's an analogous argument here as to the one that Viveki made to James Filler following the relational ontology stuff. So that argument, just very briefly, is that we've inherited a substance ontology since Aristotle, which gives priority to the relata, the things which are in relationship, and the relationship is somehow emergent or comes after the fact. And Filler's reversal was like, no, no, the relationship is primordial or first, and the relata come out of relationship. And Viveki pointed out that you can make the equivalent argument either way. And so um, you both need the relationship in order to have relata, but you need the relata in order to have the relationship. And I'm saying that in a similar way, well, yes, we may well have been sort of deceived by time and space, and we we sort of assume that consciousness or presence or Dasein is an emergent property of time and space and the world and physics and so on. And it's possible to reverse that, let's assume, by noticing that time and space are in fact a mode of being of presence. But I want to say in exactly the same way that they arise mutually. They arise mutually, they go together. And yes, this prioritizing of one over the other feels to me like a swing of the pendulum. Anyway, I'll leave this here and come back to section 2, which is the great refusal. Again, still in chapter 1.